We're very fortunate this year to have, as our guest speaker at the dinner tonight, Don McGauchie. Don would be well known to most people in the room. He's currently chairman of the Australian Agricultural Company Limited, but I think Don has a long history of involvement in the agriculture sector. He was president of the National Farmers Federation from 1994 to 98, and of course you would remember played a major role in the industrial dispute of 1998, which fundamentally changed the Australian waterfront and benefited agriculture enormously. Since that time, Don served as an advisor to the Australian government on a large number of trade and foreign affairs advisory committees. He is or has been a board member of major Australian companies and organisations including Telstra, New Farm, James Hardie Industries, GrainCorp, the Australian Wool Testing Authority, Ridley, National Foods, the Reserve Bank and the Australian Agricultural Company, of which he is currently chairman. In his spare time, he's also involved in a family farming operations based in Victoria. In recognition of all those efforts, Don's been awarded the Rabobank Agribusiness Leader of the Year, was awarded a Centenary Medal for services to agriculture, and was made an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2004. So I think you'd agree with me, there is few of the standing and experience and background in agriculture in Australia who could speak with the authority that Don is and can about the future of agriculture in Australia. So we've challenged him with a discussion about what he thinks needs to happen to benefit the agriculture sector in Australia. So please welcome Don McGauchie.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Mick, and thank you for the invitation to be here and to have the opportunity to say a few things about something that I'm passionate about, and that is agriculture in this country. As you pointed out, I am a farmer, not that I spend much time hands in the dirt these days, but my interest is still there through our family farm. My family have been farming in northern Victoria for over 160 years. And we really don't know how long before that they were farming in Scotland before they moved out here. But I've certainly been involved and worked on the land since I was a boy. I did actually spend some time full-time farming before I got involved in other activities, and I certainly remember much of that. And I guess, you know, in my role as a farmer, as a representative of farmers and NFF and other organisations, and certainly in my business roles, I've seen all that farming and all that Australian environment can throw at us. I've seen the floods and the fires, the droughts and the deaths, the booms and the busts that go to make up Australian agriculture, and it's probably the most difficult climate in every sense to farm in the world, and yet the performance of Australian farmers never ceases to amaze me. But I have to say, along the way I've learned that there's a lot more to farming than driving a tractor or mustering stock, a great deal more. To prosper as a farmer, you need to be both a survivor and an entrepreneur. You need to constantly adapt, constantly seek new opportunities and new ways of doing things. You need to be a student of nature, but also a master of the marketplace. First and foremost, though, you need to pay attention to the world you live in and work in, because if you don't, the land will teach you some lessons, and some of them can be pretty brutal. But for the purpose of this speech, I want to confine myself to three of those lessons that I think are important. The first one is resilience. Working the land in Australia is a test of character. You never know what's coming next: drought, fire, flood, commodity booms and busts. That have the capacity, you have to have the capacity to take the knocks, come up fighting and carry on. It's definitely not a life for the faint-hearted. You do have to be resilient. The second lesson is perseverance. On a farm, any worthwhile activity takes longer than you think and more effort often than you'd like it to. Whether it's planting a crop or setting up an irrigation system or raising a quality herd or flock, the investment in time and money is substantial. You have to be prepared to take a calculated risk, in fact many calculated risks, to take your chances and persevere. Otherwise, you will fail at one of the hurdles. And the third lesson is perspective. When you're a farmer, it's an advantage if you can anticipate and adapt. And even if you don't anticipate well, be able to adapt as quickly as possible to change. Anticipate and adapt to the next advance, the next season, the next market opportunity, the next piece of technology. That requires courage, but more importantly, the perspective to understand the risks and the rewards. And the reason I talk about these things, these lessons, is to say this. To prosper in the Asian century, Australian agricultural industry must be prepared to go the distance. And by going the distance, I mean showing the resilience, patience, perspective required to not just survive, but to thrive in this global marketplace. A few years ago, in fact 2013 to be precise, in a speech I said I was concerned that we as a nation were taking our future prosperity for granted. I no longer feel that way, but I remain concerned. Australians are now well aware of the fact that the investment phase of the mining boom is over. As a consequence, a belated sense of urgency is starting to bubble to the surface in our national affairs. I think Australians now understand that we can no longer rely solely on the resources sector to drive our national economy forward. People are beginning to look at new industries for opportunities, and indeed the service sector, for instance, has begun to outstrip individual parts of the resource sector, and I believe eventually will go beyond it. But also people are beginning to value the intrinsic worth of our traditional export industries such as agriculture. And I'd have to say this is a welcome change because there is great opportunity out there if we know enough and have the capacity to grasp it. But, as I said, I am still a little concerned. I am concerned because although I'm confident Australian agribusiness and farmers remain resilient, I'm not as confident of our reserves for perseverance and perspective. I believe we should be much more ambitious than we are. We're not here just to survive. So let me explain. Australia is on the doorstep of the largest middle class in the global marketplace. Right now, the Asian middle class numbers around 1 billion people, and it's projected to triple over the next 15 years to in excess of 3 billion people. To put that into perspective, we are witnessing the emergence of an Asian mega middle class that will be almost 4 times the combined populations of Europe and the United States combined. To this mega middle class, as this mega middle class grows, so too will its appetite for quality produce. Demand for food in Asia is expected to double by 2050, accounting for 70% of global middle class food consumption. This long boom is a monumental opportunity for Australian agriculture. Let me spell out the size and the scope of that opportunity. Australia currently produces enough food for about 50 million people. So I think what we should be talking is that we can double food production by 2050 and boost exports by up to 1.7 trillion over the next 4 decades. That is undoubtedly an ambitious goal, but I actually think we should be even more ambitious than that. I think we can in fact double food production in real value in the next 20 years by focusing on both quality and quantity, but particularly on quality. However, doubling food production in 2 decades would require clarity of planning and of purpose, the like of which we haven't seen for a long time in this country. We will need to recruit a whole new generation of farmers. We will need to plan and invest and act on a vast scale. We'll need to stop being one of the most expensive places in the world to process food and instead become one of the best. If we can achieve all of that, I have no doubt Australia can produce enough food to feed 100 million wealthy people. And bear in mind how small a fraction that is of that middle class that I described. I believe that we can produce enough quality produce to feed that 100 million wealthy people in that mega middle class that is developing to our near north. After all, we have the brand recognition to do it. Wherever I go around the world, the minute you talk about Australia and Australian agriculture, people come back with the same response, and that is about the quality of the food that we produce and the environment in which we produce it. So that brand recognition is remarkably strong wherever I go. We have an excellent reputation internationally for clean, quality produce. However, to become a leading supplier of quality produce across South and East Asia and China, we're going to have to go the distance. That means investing in trade negotiations. It means investing in our workforce and our infrastructure. It means thinking and acting for long-term prosperity. It also means recapturing the momentum that I think has been lost in agriculture during the 90s and the 2000s. What concerns me is that our agriculture sector is coming from a long slump, whereas many of our competitors during that same period have been booming. Brazil has captured new markets in China, 70 million tonnes of soya beans. They now export, the largest producer of soya beans in the world. Malaysia, Indonesia and the United States have significantly increased their exports during the first decade of this century. Meanwhile, Australian agriculture has not grown anything like fast enough. No doubt we were hamstrung by the millennium drought, but I don't think that is sufficient of an excuse. We have failed to invest in critical infrastructures such as road and rail. In this state, we cannot move a grain crop from the country to the ports in the year that it is produced. The rail system just is incapable of delivering it, unless we have a poor crop. And we let productivity fall as skills shortages began to bite and the median age of our farmers ticked up above the mid-50s. As a consequence of that, we have stagnated. We have lost momentum. And that is why I think we are in dangerous territory. As I said earlier, we need to anticipate and adapt for change, being open to the kinds of creative adjustment necessary to keep up with the demands of modern agriculture. And by creative adjustment, I mean operating at scale, having the capacity to invest in innovation, research and development, and fostering high-quality management. But let me be clear about one thing. I don't say creative adjustment is a euphemism for corporate farming. Many family operations have survived for generations by anticipating and adjusting and have the capability to continue to do that. Australia also has a generation of great young managers coming through the ranks. Young people with the brains and ability to modernise our industries. The challenge we face as an industry is to find creative ways to bring capital under the control of these young, great managers so that we can take advantage. I think this last point is very important. After all, in modern farming, financial liquidity and capacity is as fundamental as water security. I'm talking about investing in the future of agriculture rather than the past. Unless we commit to creative adjustment, Australian farming runs the risk of going down the same path as Japan. In Japan, farming is more like a functional museum than an industry with a workforce that's now in its 70s and an uncertain future and producing significantly less than they could had they opened up. It is not in our national interest to cling to the past. We have to embrace change and take advantage of it. That being said, I am bullish about the future of Australian agriculture. The cost of operating in Australia is far too high for us to compete at a commodity level. That is why, from the top end to Tasmania, I believe we need to focus at the high end of the market and become a major supplier of quality food to Asia's emerging middle class. I know that many firms and farms in the sector already have their eyes on this opportunity. And as chairman of AACO, I'm proud to be associated with one of these companies. AACO wants to revolutionise the northern beef industry and create a new channel to Asian markets. We want Northern Australia to benefit from Asia's growing prosperity, and we want the Asian century to be Australia's agriculture century as well. And that's one of the reasons that last year we opened the Livingstone Beef Facility, a $100 million state-of-the-art facility near Darwin that is now profitable and performing ahead of budget. It's taken a great deal of perseverance to get Livingstone up and running, but we never lost our perspective, notwithstanding I had a lot of people tell us it would never work. Livingstone is all about transforming a pastoral firm into a fully integrated beef producer and marketer, and it's creating new pathways into that lucrative Asian market as well as to the rest of the world. Over the past year and a half, the quality of our beef has been widely recognised. Our Darling Downs Wagyu was named the champion Wagyu at the Sydney Royal Spring Fine Food Show. Darling Downs Wagyu also won gold medals at the prestigious Royal Melbourne Fine Food Award and the Royal Queensland Food and Wine Show, and was named the Grand Champion Beef at the Royal Queensland Show. Our flagship Master Kobe Wagyu was also named Grand Champion Wagyu at the World Wagyu Conference. Not only that, more than half of the cattle sold at the World Wagyu Conference International Full Blood Genetics Sale were from our stud herd. AACo is now a global leader in Wagyu, one of the most exciting and rapidly growing food products in the world. Our ambition, I think, is very clear, and certainly our team understand the strategy. We want to operate at the premium end of the market through world-class products, such as that award-winning Wagyu beef, but also our high-quality live export cattle and our manufactured meat from the Livingston facility. Let me say AACo is not alone. The ag sector has countless farmers and firms with the brains, ability and ambition to succeed in this global market. And the good news is that the federal government is getting behind the industry in a meaningful way. I've spent 18 months listening to the industry, and in July released the Agricultural Competitiveness White Paper. The White Paper focuses on 5 priority areas: giving farmers a fairer go through competition, regulation and tax reform; investing in infrastructure such as transport, water and technology; improving our planning for and response to drought; investing in productivity through innovation and R&D; and opening up new international markets. All in all, the White Paper is a complex, multifaceted, multi-year investment in the agricultural sector worth more than $4 billion. It's an opportunity for the kind of creative adjustment that I'm talking about, particularly through infrastructure investment. What we need now is to invest the time and money necessary to modernise Australian agriculture for the task ahead. For that to occur, we need real leadership from industry, from the finance sector and from government. In other words, we need resilience, patience and perspective. Unfortunately, when it comes to creating a more internationally competitive agricultural sector, I still think there is a shortage of perspective. For instance, some people have a dam fixation. In some circles, the prevailing view appears to be that the answer to every challenge we face is building a new dam. If only life were that simple. The agriculture sector needs more than another dam to double its production over the next 20 years, much more. We need to focus on costs, productivity, infrastructure and innovation. By productivity, I mean tackling labour costs, which have frankly gotten right out of control. Australia is now one of the most expensive places in the world in which to process food, be that meat, horticulture or any other of our products. That Darwin facility cost us about 40% more than it would have cost us to build it in the United States. I mean tackling energy costs. We have some of the most expensive energy in the world. And again, we are producing energy on site at Darwin because it's cheaper than buying it from the Darwin grid. Significantly cheaper. And I mean finding ways to attract skilled young people into the land to replace that ageing workforce. By infrastructure, I mean freeing up the bottlenecks, but also expanding the national road and rail system and port facilities. And I mean investing in bridges as well as roads so that regionally and rurally based industries are less affected by wet seasons and by floods. If we invest in the right infrastructure and adopt the right policies, we can put high quality fresh produce, chilled not frozen, onto those dining tables of Asia that offer us so much opportunity. And finally, by innovation, I mean investment in research and development, not only in the private sector, but also in the government sector, because there's much in agricultural R&D that is not capturable. And having been on both sides of this, I know what is and what isn't. And there are large gaps that are not being filled by the government sector, the universities, and the CSIRO and the departments. So that in a sustainable way, we make the most of every acre of land and every litre of water that we have. That will require a reversal in the trend of reducing investment in public research and development that's gone on over the last decade. Of course, security of essential services, whether they're electricity, technology or water, is important. But the truth is this: in the 21st century, water security is a basic requirement. Water is the foundation of production, but to grasp that opportunity that we're developing across Asia and beyond, we need to appreciate that bigger picture. To understand what is required, we need look no further than our Federal Trade Minister, Andrew Robb. Andrew has done a brilliant job sealing bilateral trade deals with China, Japan and Korea, not to mention the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The China deal alone is transformational. It's transformational because as China transitions from a consumption-driven economy, or to a consumption-driven economy, the free trade deal creates the opportunity for Australia's other sectors, such as agriculture, to benefit from what the decades-long boom in goods and services will bring to us. To understand the scale of the opportunity, consider the case of New Zealand. New Zealand raised Chinese investment thresholds and signed an FTA with China in 2008. That led to a quadrupling in Kiwi exports to China. If Australia can grasp the opportunities of the China FTA alone, we will go a long way to achieving my ambition of feeding 100 million wealthy people within the next 20 years. So let me finish by asking some rhetorical questions, but ones I think we should all focus on. Do you believe it is possible for Australia to double its food production within 2 decades? Do you believe we have the wherewithal to feed 100 million wealthy people? If you don't believe it's possible, if you don't believe we have the wherewithal, then I'd like you to tell me why. Can you identify the barriers that stand in our way, and therefore then what can we do about them? Are you prepared to do what is required to overcome those barriers? Do we have the resilience? Do we have the patience? Do we have the perseverance? Because our destiny as an industry and a nation will be defined by our willingness to find the right answers to those questions. Thank you.
The culture of our roundtable is very much that we encourage engagement and questions and discussion rather than just sitting back and passively receiving information. So I've convinced Don to take a number of questions if we can encourage that out of the audience. I'm going to kick off by one of the things that strikes you when you travel and talk to and interact with agriculture sectors in other locations is the much greater sense of a commonality of purpose in the agriculture sector in a lot of overseas jurisdictions. So I'm wondering whether you have any observations on that, because a lot of the stuff you talk about is doable if only we could get all of us pointed in the one direction and get after it. I mean, I think that's one of the lessons. Now, whether we've taken such a hiding over the first decade of the millennia and therefore are still regathering our breath from that terrible drought and certainly the almost Dutch disease conditions driven by the mining boom, whether that's lost momentum, or I'm just interested in your views of whether culturally the ag sector in Australia can get to a point where it's got that commonality of purpose that means a lot of that stuff is achievable.
Well, I think it's a really interesting question about where Australian agriculture has come from, why we are where we are, and what the issues are. I mean, I think we took quite a bad wrong turn quite a long time ago when we put far too much faith in statutory marketing arrangements and statutory operations that really were not well equipped. And maybe they did quite a good job in their early days. I wouldn't make a judgment about that. But over time, they were not things that adjusted to the sort of changes that were required. And indeed, they undoubtedly crowded out the opportunity for Australia to have some agricultural champions that other countries have had. Whilst I was involved in trying to privatise the Australian Wheat Board 20-odd years ago, I got very little help. And I think they focused on the wrong things and then eventually, of course, collapsed and left a very great hole. One of the things that's interesting about a company like AACO is we are big enough to actually do some of the things that most farmers would like to do. With a herd of over 500,000 cattle and reasonable access to capital, we are looking at branding our product. We now sell 80% of our product under our own brand. We will expand that not just in quantity but in the way we deliver the brand. I was in South Korea last week, and saw our product in a full glass cabinet in one of the big supermarkets, fully branded, top-end product selling at about $100 a kilogram. We are able to, with the scale of the business, do that, and we will do a great deal more of that. Our biggest market is Korea. Our second biggest market is the United States. Third biggest is Japan, then the Middle East, and then Europe. And whilst it's not our biggest market, our most profitable market is what we sell in London. Wagyu and Harrods at £250 a kilogram. Now, we won't be able to sell all of our product at that price, but we can generate really significant returns from that product. Now, what does that mean? Now, not many people have got the capacity to have 500,000 cattle to be able to pick out some of the 60,000 Wagyus to put into the marketplace. But I think people can work together much more effectively than they have in the past. But the farming community themselves have got to take a very positive approach to this. And all too often, and I've seen this happen, people start to get together in groups to market product. Somebody comes along and offers them, $5 a tonne more for their product, and they'll desert the business. We have got to have that longer-term view about the way in which we go about marketing our products. So I think we have taken some wrong turns in the past, and we've got to correct those, and we've got to make up for those mistakes. And I don't think there's any doubt. You take companies like Murray Goulburn, who are now selling a very significant amount of their product into China at very good prices, and I was talking to the Chairman and Chief Executive yesterday about the opportunities that they see. They are on a sufficient scale to be able to do that as a cooperative. So there are all sorts of models that I think we can use if we're prepared to look at them and give them the longer term commitment that farmers need to give to get that outcome.
Question, Don, about AACO. I understand your point about perseverance and resilience. Is AACO best served in its ambitions as a listed company on the ASX? Does that provide long-term support? What you're aiming to achieve?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I mean, the problem with the Australian marketplace, and whilst I think our superannuation industry has been a remarkable one and has a lot of great merit, there is far too much measurement around short-term performance. And having been on the board of trustees of a superannuation company, I know exactly how it works. That if everyone doesn't perform in every 3 months, then they get tipped. And one of the tragedies is we find it much easier to attract long-term patient capital from offshore than we do from onshore. Now, we've got some very faithful mum and dad investors, but the Australian institutions are just not great. So we've got some high net worth individuals in Australia who have invested. We've got high net worth individuals from overseas, and we've got institutions from overseas. But very little Australian institutional support. So it's a great way of raising capital. I mean, if we need to raise capital, we can raise capital quite quickly. We've done it twice. I think we've raised about 500 million since I've been chairman for recapitalising and setting ourselves up to do what we're planning to do. But we have that discussion from time to time. But there's no reason. We have no ambitions to change. We're happy with the structure as it is, and it has advantages and disadvantages. But I would like to see Australian institutions, and particularly institutions like the Future Fund, take a little more interest. But not just in listed companies, though. I think this whole question of finding ways in which to provide capital for young farmers to get into the business and not have to own all the land themselves. There are all sorts of opportunities there that the institutional investors could very well take a part in.
Don, I have an easy question for you.
They're always the dangerous ones.
Having had so many directorship and chairmanship roles, Delene Ray from OB Organic.
I've been based in Hong Kong for a number of years and just recently returned to Australia, and so I'm very interested in the corporate governance of our industry, agriculture in general, but specifically beef. And I don't actually know too many people, so I'm learning about who's who in the zoo. I'd be interested in your opinion about, as a chairman, what you look for in directors. So you've obviously got directors that are leaving or that you'd like to leave, and new directors that you'd like to recruit. So as an emerging director, what do we need to do to position ourselves for board positions in high-performing agricultural companies?
Well, there's a certain very large bear trap in that question, which I will avoid. In fact, I have been responsible for changing all of the board on AACO since I've been chairman, and all but one of the board on New Farm since I've been chairman. So, I think board renewal is absolutely critical. What do we look for? Well, obviously experience is valuable, and that makes it hard for people to break in. And it's one of the hardest worlds for someone to break into, the directorship. One of the reasons for that is because it's terribly easy to put someone on a board, and it's very hard to get them off if it doesn't work. And so most of us, I think for very good reason, are a little risk averse about that situation. I think that's a pity. Now, I don't have an easy answer to how you fix that, because I don't think it's a good idea for directors to be ganging up on other directors. But you look for people who are, first of all, experienced if you can find them. I think diversity is very valuable, again, if you can find the right people. You want people who can fit in with the group, but who are capable of challenging. And that, I think, is the hardest thing for most people to do. Some people are challengers and some people are people who fit in. But the ability to be able to challenge, to ask good, strong questions, not to be afraid of asking a question that might sound like it's a bit naive, but to do that in a way which is constructive. Look, I think for people who want to get into this world, you've got to try and find ways of getting some experience, and a lot of that can be done from not-for-profits. There are a lot of those around that at least give you something. I have a very strong view that I use executive search even if I've picked somebody that I want and I think is the appropriate person. They will be put through a rigorous process to make sure that the judgment is correct. One of the things that I think is important, and I know it's a little controversial, is that I think every existing director on a board has a veto over a new director. So I think everyone on the board should meet the prospective new directors, and if anyone is uncomfortable, then you don't proceed. Now, that's part of that risk-averse business I'm talking about, but I've seen businesses torn apart by the fact that the board can't work together. So it's quite an important issue. But it's a challenging world to get into, I know, and I think we probably should be more creative in thinking about ways in which we can bring some people in who don't have the full experience you'd like. But, there's a limit to how many directors you can have, how big a board should be, the amount of money you can afford to pay, all of those things that make that a challenging question.
I'd like to unrhetoricalise one of your rhetorical questions, if you wouldn't mind.
Go ahead.
But first of all, I've just returned from the States, and I was privileged enough a few years ago to be given a version of the very tie you're wearing, and I think you should get into textiles, because I could have sold it 100 times over for $100. The Yanks loved all the brands. But my question is, I think I can answer one of the key issues in regards to the premium market, and that is acceptance of technology. I know AACO accepts, uses HGPs and things, but that's the big battle we're fighting. We're being asked to be more productive at the very same time that we're being asked to be more and more organic. I'd love your take on that.
Well, look, I think it's, first of all, the tie is in fact the brands that AACO has had on its properties over the last 190 years. So that's the reference to the tie. R.M. Williams made these up for us a few years ago. Look, I think it's a question of what market you want to be in. It's not everybody that's out there saying they want organic products. A lot of people, you know, they want quality, but they want a price. Some people are prepared to pay extraordinary amounts of money to get exactly what they want. The first trick is to know what your market is and to aim for that market very carefully. So I don't think we should, you know, see the market as homogeneous. It's not. There are huge opportunities to differentiate the product. But what you have to do in this situation is to see what is it you want to be. What do you want to sell to? And I can tell you that the bulk, we do use HGPs, but we've got the largest piece of land outside Europe accredited for European Union access, which is completely free of HGPs. Now, we have the benefit of 17 million acres of land, so we can set a bit aside here and there to do different things. But individuals can do that on either part or all of their property. So I think you need to work it out, you know, what is your market? What are you aiming for? And then be very focused about that and understand exactly what you're dealing with. And so there are a whole range of it. I mean, there's 180 million hectares of genetically modified crop grown in the world this year. It's probably got over 200 million by now. So to suggest that organically modified crops, are not acceptable in the marketplace is nonsense. I mean, they clearly are because of the volume that's out there that's being used. But also, I think we keep looking at newer technologies, and certainly our ability to identify gene markers will mean that we can there's actually more diversity within the genes of some organisms that you don't actually have to go outside if you can pick it out. And we've certainly found this with the work we've been doing on omega-3 canola. Now, it is genetically modified because that's where Siro came from in the first place. But as we develop better and better technology for identifying genes and genetic markers and working out what's in the genes, I actually think we'll be able to pick enough out of the genes of existing organisms that we will barely need to use, what has become traditionally known as genetically modified organisms. And there is a huge amount in the genes that means we don't need to use some of the products that people are finding objectionable. But nevertheless, there's a hell of a lot of market that doesn't find those things objectionable and is quite prepared to pay good price for good product. So the first thing is to know your market and aim very carefully for it and be highly disciplined about that.
Claire Miller from Dairy Australia. I was interested, you were talking about the potential for Australia to feed 100 million very wealthy people in Asia, and by comparison that you look at places like Brazil and Indonesia and Malaysia and the way they've boosted their agricultural production and are taking advantage of that. It's just from the outside, those countries seem to have done it at a pretty high environmental cost. They've cleared forests, they have forest fire issues, habitat and water degradation, and I don't think that's a path that we would want to go down in Australia. And in fact, some of our constraints to growth are because our farmers do have to abide by fairly strong environmental safeguards, and that is a good thing. So I was just wondering whether you see that as a constraint on our capacity to grow, or how we might get around that.
No, I don't particularly see that as a constraint at all. I think the methodology and technologies that we have available to us will enable us to double by real value the output of Australian agriculture without seriously damaging the environment. I mean, we will affect the environment, of course. I think it's always interesting that the Europeans are very quick to criticise Brazil for clearing some forest when the whole of Europe was forested 2,000 years ago. You couldn't walk through most of Europe. You had to go up the rivers to get from place to place. Now, of course, the landscape that people regard as beautiful and needs to be protected is highly man-made. But there was a time, if you look at London, for instance, when the Houses of Parliament, they had to stop and leave because the Thames was so smelly they couldn't stand to be in the Houses of Parliament. The turn of the beginning of the 20th century, photochemical smog stopped London almost every night. These things can be cleaned up. As far as Brazil's concerned, they have substantially stopped clearing forest. There's still a big lump of the Amazon still left. There's a massive amount of land that they've cleared, and the capacity for them to increase their output on that land is enormous. If you go and visit it, for instance, a railway line from the southern Mato Grosso to Sao Paulo or across to the where they produce the iron ore, in my view, would produce another 100 million tonnes of maize if they can get their freight costs to rail freight rather than road freight levels. The Indonesians, what they're doing in burning forest is nonsense, and they shouldn't be doing it. And I think most Indonesians don't like that any more than the rest of the world does. And they don't need to do that to increase their output at all. That's not helping a great deal. But coming back to Australia, I think our capacity, our environmental stewardship has improved enormously. One of the things that people have got, I think, has gone unremarked is if you look at what is probably the third great drought since European settlement, the one at the start of this century that went with the Federation drought and the Second World War drought. What was the thing that distinguished that massively? No dust storms. Each one of those previous droughts, we had massive dust storms. Now, I know we had some rabbits in those days, but nevertheless, the rabbits weren't all the problem. The technology of farming in those days, where to kill weeds you cultivated and cultivated and cultivated and destroyed the carbon in the soil and you destroyed the structure of the soil, by being able to get to zero or minimum tillage, we've now been able to go through a very serious drought without a significant dust storm. The only dust storm we had was the one here in Sydney, and that came from the desert country, south of Alice Springs. So that's just one example. I think we are so much better now at managing our water supplies, and even with a significant reduction in water out of the Murray-Darling Basin for a number of reasons, we're still producing a significant amount of product, and if we work at it, we'll get better at it. I think our capacity to manage the northern rivers, and when I say the northern rivers, I mean the ones above the tropic, is going to be well informed by some of the not such good decisions we made in the Murray-Darling Basin. So there's massive amounts of water up there that we can tap without causing significant environmental damage. And our experiences of the last 20 years or so show us that we can significantly improve output without major environmental damage.
Thanks, Don. David Clark. Don, I'd just like to follow up on that last question. The area I'm concerned about is competing land use, and obviously probably not quite such a problem for AACO, but some of the inside or developed country where real estate value and lifestyle blocks is pushing out agricultural production. And if policy changes is not made or something's not done to arrest that, we will see the removal of agriculture from a lot of the more developed, earlier developed areas of agriculture. Is that a problem, or do you just let that happen and redevelop the top end into agriculture and forget about the central tablelands of New South Wales?
And a lot of Victoria.
Look, I mean, these are always very vexed questions about land use and who should have the right to the land and who owns what in the land, as we've seen. I mean, I think Australians are only now realising that freehold title is a very limited title in many respects, and that what the Crown has kept to itself is quite substantial. And but my family came to Bendigo in the 1850s. One part of the family went mining and one part of the family went farming. So we've kind of had this debate in the family for a long time. I'm not a great one for intervening, particularly. I mean, I think these things will work themselves out one way and another. And certainly I've seen people bought out for urban development who then brought that significant amount of capital to underdeveloped areas and made a big difference to those areas. So I think the market can look a bit perverse for a while, but it generally gets it right. and so I'm not one to have government intervening too much in these things if we can possibly keep them out of it. And I think the opportunities for further expanding output by investment in a huge amount of Australia's land mass is really very significant.
Snow Barlow, Melbourne University. Don, to achieve your feeding 100 million middle-class Asians by 2050, how big a problem is capital? You peripherally sort of dealt with the trillion-plus superannuation industry that doesn't regard agriculture as an investment category at this point. So do you think capital is a problem to achieving that vision that you have, which many of us would like to sign on to? And is somehow turning around either by promotion or regulation a way to unlock that superannuation industry, or is that a furphy and we should just get it from somewhere else?
Look, I don't actually think a shortage of capital is a big issue at all. I think there's plenty of capital out there with people who like to invest. And in some cases, we're actually trying to restrict them from investing here. And I think the ridiculously xenophobic attitude towards Asian investment, particularly Chinese, that's a bigger problem to me than almost anything else. There's plenty of people out there who would like to bring money in. I think it's a structural issue as much as anything. How do we set up the right structures to actually access that capital? Because there's no doubt, in my view, it's there. I've been offered remarkable amounts of capital to do things. Now, we haven't wanted to take that up, but I don't believe the actual availability of capital is an issue. But if we are xenophobic about it, it will become an issue. And I think the Australian superannuation industry will sooner or later wake up to the fact that others are buying in at the prices they should be buying in at, and will buy in due course. So I certainly would go in the exact opposite direction from regulation. I just don't think that's the right way to go at all. That will always produce the worst outcome.